Welcome everyone. It's great to have you with us on what is hopefully a glorious sunny day for you wherever you are. Certainly here in Harpenden, it's pretty fantastic. So yeah, I'm glad you've made the time, made the effort to come and be with us and join with us. So thank you for that. Hope you've got your lunch ready and your drinks ready for a really good, thorough, good conversation we're going to be having with David. So with further ado, firstly, David, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. It's all right. I'm just going to give a little bit of a plotted history, just so everyone kind of gets some context about you and the organization you lead. And then we're going to get into some really good questions. And just for everyone listening, we're going to be covering topics from leadership, culture, engagement, racism in the workplace. Kind of want to look at everything really and have a really good, honest conversation about some of the big topics that we're facing as corporate businesses. So Wates Group, I think, was established in 1897 and employs almost 4,000 people.
That's right.
The founder was Edward Wates. Wikipedia is honestly, it's just brilliant. But you're now on your fourth generation of the family members, is that correct?
Yeah, we are. And the first of the fifth generation to join began on our graduate and trainee program in January, working on one of our sites in London. So yeah, it's continuing.
Fantastic. So we'll definitely talk a little bit about, being a family-owned business, but you're privately owned construction, residential and property services business in the UK. A little bit about you. So you became CEO in 2018, I think it was.
That's right.
Previously CFO at Crossrail and Laing O'Rourke.
Not CFO of Laing O'Rourke, I was the divisional FT there. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And you'd also worked at Accenture and Arthur Andersen.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Not my fault.
Yeah, I was going to say, not there at that wrong time.
No.
And before that, you did modern history from Oxford, I think was where you got your degree from. So fantastic. Well, look, sorry, I was going to say, David, thank you so much for your time. We totally get, and everyone listening will understand, CEOs are pretty busy people. So for you to give up an hour for us to have this honest conversation is really, really appreciated. And even more importantly, knowing you a little bit as I do, I know it'll be a really honest conversation where we can look at some, these big topics and really get into how do you as a CEO face and lean into some of the big sort of headwinds that we're facing and some of the big topics that are being talked about, not just in companies, but actually across the UK and in fact the world. So I guess why I want to start is probably around leadership. And by the way, everyone listening, please do, as Lucy said, drop in your comments and questions. I will try and get to them as much as I can. As I said, we'll be covering some really good topics, including we'll be asking David what's his favorite leadership book, what's the movie that he's enjoyed the most, and what's his favorite food. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's start at the beginning. So I think you and I actually met in 2019, I think it was.
Yeah.
And like most senior leaders I've met and had the privilege of working with, you had ambitious kind of goal and vision of what you wanted to do with the organization. You definitely had a plan, which you called your guiding framework, was the language you brought to that, which really focused on behaviors, goals, and really defining your purpose very clearly. I think it's inspiring better ways of creating the places, communities and businesses of tomorrow. Which I have to say, right, isn't bad for a CEO to get it that pithy. I mean, honestly, the amount of work I've had to do, and they're like, they're trying to get some pithy purpose, and it's like 14 lines. You're like, no one's going to remember that. Actually, that one, I give you credit. It's pretty good.
I had a lot of help.
Yeah, and obviously you talk about being progressive, sustainable, and trusted. But I guess where I want to start and really kind of get into the meat of the conversation is. That was when we met, it was pre-COVID, right? And I guess what I'd love to know is, I don't want to particularly go over everything that happened during COVID because, we've done a lot of those and I know you've talked a lot about that, but what I would like to know is how did COVID impact you as a leader and what did it mean for how you saw leadership, if that makes sense, going through COVID? What's it done for you as a leader personally and what's it made you think about leadership in the future?
Okay, well, I think fundamentally nothing changed about the core of how you should lead people. I think being thoughtful about how you care for and develop the careers and the lives of the people that you work with and help them thrive, being clear about the purpose of what people are doing and the future they're working towards. I guess encouraging them and supporting them so that they believe that more is possible, and explaining to them what's in it for them. I think there's other things like being fair about how you recognize performance, how you manage performance, and the opportunities that you give people. So you set clear goals and clear parameters for how you want to work. And then I think listening hard to what your team is telling you, and trying to be kind, or at least yourself, when you're having to do the harder stuff. Now, I think what did change during the pandemic was that the context we were operating in made it harder to do some of those basic things. I think being remote, as many of us were for a while, made it harder to acknowledge and respect and respond to the different ways in which people were experiencing what was going on in the world and in this country. We had in our business a really significant division between those people who were still going out to our sites, to our contracts, into people's homes to maintain them. We look after about 500,000 social homes around the country, and going into people's homes to make repairs when the residents themselves were naturally very stressed, and our people were going into that sort of environment. So we had a lot of people who were out there every day doing the work to keep the economy going and to keep our business going, and other people having to do the work that they do and make their contribution in isolation at home, supposedly in a safe environment. But for many of our younger people, they were, sat on sofas in shared flats, trying to do their jobs, and that was very stressful in its own way. But there were very different experiences for people, and people were dealing with real fear and with loss and with constant change that was happening very, very quickly, and was difficult for people to respond to. Also, I think complicating that environment, we did have some very difficult decisions to make. We furloughed almost 1,400 colleagues at peak, and we made almost 300 of our colleagues redundant fairly early on in the crisis. And those things are very difficult decisions. They weigh on your conscience as a leader, and actually as the people around me, the whole leadership team, in terms of, are you doing that in a way that is fair? Are you explaining the purpose of those changes to people? Are you avoiding the survivor's guilt and the things that people will need to process? And it really tested our commitment to the goals and the behaviours that you described that set out in our guiding framework. Could we hold on to what mattered to us? Could we maintain contact with our future and our intentions for the business whilst going through this very difficult moment? I felt very strongly, and I think the people immediately around me felt very strongly, that people wanted to be led, and there was a real sense that people wanted to believe that they were being led well, and that was part of the crutch that people needed to support their own psychological comfort and safety in that moment. And that obviously brings a responsibility with it. And I think in terms of what my response to that was, just you talking about, showing my workings, explaining why we were taking the steps to shut offices, keep sites open, and trusting people with that information. And the idea of trust was particularly important with our sites and our contracts, because shortly after the national lockdown was announced, we paused everything for 48 hours and we shut everything, all of our sites and those contracts where we could. And we said to the local teams, look, we're going to leave this in your hands. If you believe, because the government's asking us to keep going, if you believe you can do that safely, then we will support you in doing that. But if you believe you can't, then we'll support you in that too. And every single site team came back and said that they wanted to keep going and adopted new ways of working so that they were safe on site. So that was trust repaid, and that idea of trust being repaid throughout the crisis, I think, was an important part of what got us through.
Just listening to you, David, it's interesting because, and I hope everyone else listening kind of picks up the multitude of decisions you were being asked to make as the senior leader, because rightly we spend a lot of time focused on employees, and that's one of my big sort of focuses is how are we engaging the employee, how are we helping them thrive, and we've listened really carefully to employees through this, but sometimes, not always, but sometimes the leadership perspective gets missed, because understandably everyone's focused on the vast majority of people and how they're feeling and what they're going through and what they're thinking. But I know when we met up just after, I was like, how are you doing? Because often leaders don't get asked that, and there's nothing better for any of those listening, just occasionally saying to your senior leaders, how are you getting on? I mean, genuinely as a person, not even as a leader, where are you at?
Yes.
How are you getting through? Sorry, you're going to say?
Well, I think that, my wife's a hospital doctor, and so she was kind of exposed to the virus very early, got it, was pretty unwell as lockdown hit. And so and I had two teenage sons, one of whose GCSEs were being messed around, algorithms, and cancelled. And so there were other things, and yet I do recognise that I was, relative to most people, in a very positive position with, a safe home to live in and work from, and enough to eat and drink and all of that. So, but yeah, there are pressures on everyone, I think, across an organisation at times like that.
Yeah. Well, the difference is, I totally hear that, and you're right that ours and many other people probably even listening on this weren't at danger necessarily of going under or any of those kind of things through the pandemic. But actually, your mental well-being and your emotional state, as we talk about at Impulse, matters quite a lot, because you're making decisions from that. And we've all watched Boris, and we've watched Nicola and other senior leaders, and truthfully, we've kind of cared about their emotional states. Go, I hope they're okay, because they're making really flipping huge decisions that affect our lives.
Yeah.
And you want to know that they're in a good place. But just want to go back over a couple of things there, because for everyone listening, there's some really powerful moments you say about, for you, leadership is about caring for people and developing them. And I don't think senior leaders say that enough. And then those who do say it enough, it's about how do you show it? How do you actually tangibly show people that that's what you're doing? Because often it's a bit like, I was just at the chemist before this, and I was listening to the two chemists having a really honest debate about Boris, actually, at his speech at the climate change. And they were saying, wasn't it embarrassing? Wasn't it awful? He was making jokes. I didn't actually hear it, but they were really like, and all these politicians, they're all out for themselves. They're all in it for themselves. It can be sometimes like employees when they talk about senior leaders. I know, because I've sat in lots of listening sessions, they go, oh, those leaders, it's all about them and what they want and, all the rest. But for them to hear actually a leader articulate, what I want to bring to the organization is for leaders to care, to help develop people, to help them thrive, to help them. You used a really interesting line. You said to show them that more is possible. I'd love you just to lean into that a little bit and tell me a bit about, because that's an interesting aspect of leadership, that it's to help people see that more is possible. So just tell us what you mean by that.
Okay, so I think there's just two comments I'd make on that. The first, all of this stuff comes from what influences you and develops you. And I had the very great fortune of being taught by some brilliant people in my secondary school in High Wycombe. And one of the people who taught me through my sixth form, he kind of, if something was worth doing, it was worth doing as well as you possibly could. And he pushed me and my friends around me to produce our best work. And it left me with this belief that you can always change anything, and you can make it different and better, and that it is worth the effort. And in my life and work and the people who work with me, actually, when you do push harder, you can achieve some incredible things. And one of the things you have to be careful about that is you can't always be running in sixth gear. You do need, there have to be peaks and troughs to the rhythm of your work. But if you focus on the stuff that's important and give it your very, very best shot, then that's been worthwhile to me. And the bit about showing people all the way through the organization that development and people's development, the purpose that people have in their work and how they do their work matters. It goes back again to people I worked for at the beginning of my career. I worked for a woman called Julia Smith when I was at Arthur Andersen, who was just a superb tax specialist. And but she would take the time with junior people like me, 4 or 5 years behind her. I obviously didn't know which way was up, because I'd done a history degree and had no idea how accountancy works, but she would take the time to show me how this should be done, and why that mattered to our customers, and why that mattered to HMRC, and why it was worth the effort. And her taking that time to show up and spend time, be present, it gives a it makes the effort that you're asking people to give more meaningful. And I learned lots, both from a technical and behavioural point of view from being around someone like her, or I worked for a guy called Julian Scan at Accenture, and again, he would take time to explain why he was adopting an approach, and to explain the things that he thought about before asking us to adopt a particular course of action. And that giving time to people was so significant to me in my development. I think that that's a really important part of how leaders show that they are interested in and care about the people around them.
Yeah, and so David, like that to me is so interesting. And I talk about time that leaders give is like a superpower. It makes them just this awesome superhero. It shouldn't, but it does, because so few leaders do it. And often when we're running coaching sessions with lots of senior leaders, we'll be talking about all the things about leading, everything you've just said, and I'll go, but what's the one thing that's going to stop you? And invariably someone within seconds goes, time. It's always time. And I'm like, yeah, it's the most precious commodity that people have predominantly. But how do we take what is so obvious, and just what you described, like how much it helped you in your career and how much it's helped others that I'm sure you've done it too. How do you in your organization, and if everyone listening, they're probably thinking, yeah, I'd love to say to my leaders, take more time on employee engagement, take more time to listen to your employees, take more time to actually care and understand where your people are at. And by the way, one of the biggest issues coming through COVID was this issue of managers giving their people time to actually have the conversations, not just to check in, because a lot of that was happening. Are you doing the work? What's going on if they were working from home? But making time for them just to talk, to support them in their role. So how do you at Wates do that with your leaders? How do you, because your leaders will come to you and say, David, far too busy.
I think it was one of the pleasures of, because what's happened over the last 18 months has had some positive effects as well. And one of the pleasures was seeing the way in which teams within teams would get together and twice a week have a virtual coffee morning to stay in touch, and that people would care enough and take the time to do those things, and to spend an hour and a half or do a pub quiz virtually with their teams in the afternoon. And those forms of connection actually people were then relaxed, and they did share the things that were really on their minds and the things that they were struggling with. And there was some more formal things as well, because whilst COVID's obviously been a real focal point for a lot of what people have done over the last 18 months, there have been other changes as well. We have obviously left the European Union, and we're seeing some of the impacts of that. At the moment, the climate crisis has come into much tighter focus, but particularly I think the social crisis that followed George Floyd's murder last year, that led to us putting in place quite a lot of listening groups to understand what colleagues were going through. And I mean, some of those were frankly upsetting to hear what people were dealing with at that moment and what they dealt with in their lives. And it's changed some of how we, some of what we spend time talking about, what we measure, how we're going to pay people will be altered as a result of what we've learned through those sort of listening groups. And as I said, they were pretty upsetting. You hear when people are revealing, and the courage of people to reveal some very difficult stuff about their experiences in life. Actually, the time that you spend listening is hugely valuable, not only to the people that you listen to, but mostly for you in learning a little more about the world you're operating in.
Yeah, brilliant. Listen, and we're gonna come on to George Floyd and his murder and the impact that has had and is still having, and the what that means for things like racism, diversity, inclusion in the workplace. We're going to come on to that in a few minutes. But just before we do, two final quick questions around leadership. Again, I think probably everyone listening will go, what you've described is the dream of what they would love their leaders to be like in terms of caring for, listening, empowering people, helping people to thrive. What do you do when leaders aren't and haven't been for some time acting like that? How do you kind of handle that? Because again, there's a lot of HR and employee engagement specialists on. I'm sure they'd love to know, like, what do we do when we've seen some poor behaviors in leaders, and we want to influence the CEO to say, come on, you know, this is having an impact. What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think being fair and clear are the remedies there. We've in looking at some of our data about the structure of our workforce, how people progress through the organisation. I think we've recognised that there are some areas where we need to do better, and the messages that I've shared with my leadership team are super clear that this is part of your job. It represents an unacceptable form of success to simply deliver your numbers in Wates now, and we need to change, and for the organisation to change, leaders must change. And we've been clear with people that if the leaders we have don't change, we'll have to change the leaders. Now, we have to give those people, the ideal is we don't have to change anyone, and that we can support people to make the changes that they need to make, to go through the processes of self-reflection, self-examination, to educate themselves on some of the issues that we need to spend much more time on in leading our business. But we've been talking about some of this now for a year or two, and we want to accelerate progress, and that is the job of the people leading the organisation. And that kind of clarity about what is required of leaders in our organisation. How are we going to measure that so that we are fair in how we evaluate people's performance? And then what are the minimum standards of behaviour that we're going to tolerate? You are as good as the worst bit of behaviour that you accept, aren't you, as an organisation? And I think we've recently been giving some crystal clear guidance to our people about some of the behavioural changes that we want to see, and we're supporting people in making those changes. We have an iLead programme that we've put in place to help people understand the impact of their language, their behaviour, the tone of voice, really understand what microaggressions mean to people in our organisation and the bits of the community that we touch in our work. And so in terms of when what's my objective there is to be clear what's required to support people to get there, to be clear if there's a problem, and then ultimately to make sure that the problem is fixed one way or another really quickly.
So I've got to ask then, what's the time? What's the time scale you'd give? So from someone being identified as not performing in leadership, I love what you said, by the way, if leaders don't change, we'll have to change the leaders. So I'm intrigued because, as a CEO, how long would you give it to go? It's been identified, there's been some remedy, we've really tried to support them, we've offered coaching, we've given regular feedback. At what point do you go, honestly, I've got to call it?
I think because the things that we're focusing on have been in place now for a couple of years, I think, and we are now rolling out quite clear measurement around how people are working to improve the diversity of their teams, the difference that they're making to the amount of carbon or waste that our operations generate. When we get to kind of the end of this year, we'll have a pretty clear view of how people have performed. Now, where people aren't making a difference, I think you go through the normal thing you go through of a performance improvement plan. You give people an appropriate amount of time, 3 to 6 months, depending on the severity of the failure and the extent of the change that's required. You give them the support, and then you call it at the end of that period. I've never been a fan of those things rolling forward constantly. I think, particularly for people who are at the level where they work directly with me, we need to get this done.
Yeah, no, it's really, really helpful to hear. And I've pushed you a little bit there, David, because having worked across lots of organizations, the number one thing that in the vernacular pisses people off is when they see leaders behaving one way, which is against what the culture is being, and it not being dealt with. No one actually calling out and saying, hey, enough, that needs to be changed or removed.
Well, we've already had a couple of very gifted leaders leave the business because the alignment wasn't there.
No, thank you for that. And you've had someone come in and say, great response. It has to start with the CEO setting the tone, which I would agree with. So thank you to Anonymous for that. So let's move on. And as we said, for everyone listening, we're going to be covering the climate crisis and looking at what David and Wates are doing there. We're going to be looking at some of the very ambitious targets you've set around that. We're going to be looking at engagement and the retention issues that a lot of businesses are facing right now. But before we do, I want to come on to a very big topic that we described around diversity inclusion. And David, you've actually set some really ambitious targets, and you know, credit to you for doing that. And you've basically said that you want to better reflect society, and you've given yourself to 2025 to go, look, let's really move the dial significantly by 2025, so next 4 years. And you've actually sort of put these out, sort of, so non-white employees from 12.5% to 20%. On gender, it's currently 20% of employees. You want to see that move to 40% female. LGBTQ is 2%. You want to move that to 5%. I think disability was 1%, and you want to move that to 3%. So they're pretty ambitious targets, knowing the world of work and kind of where you're starting from. Before we go into Wates itself, you touched on George Floyd's murder, and I know you and I had some very open conversations about this. And I guess I want to start, as you look back on your life, do you see that white privilege has helped you? Would you accept that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different types of privilege that I've benefited from. It's not only being white. I think actually, you know, being a man has been hugely beneficial. And actually, over the last probably 2 years, I've changed the stories that I tell myself about my own life. And I think until a couple of years ago, probably the central narrative was that I'd faced all these obstacles and difficulties, and I'd worked very hard and overcome them, and wasn't that cool. And actually, with closer reflection, it turns out that none of those obstacles were determinative in how my life has panned out. And in fact, the things that have been determinative are that, you know, I grew up in a nice part of the country, got to go to a really nice secondary school that got me to a good university with the help of a mum who was a teacher. That got me into a good first job, and from there, as I became more senior, every room that I walked into contained a greater and greater proportion of people who looked exactly like me. So I was completely relaxed, able to perform at my best and be completely comfortable straight away. And that went also for the people who tended to interview me for all of the roles that I've had in the later part of my career. And actually, when you compare that to some of the way my sister had been treated through the school system, through the university system, in work, you know, I had huge advantages relative to Steph, and she did better than me at every single level of academic achievement. But you know, on the day that she went into the office of the partner she worked for in a major law firm and said, I'm going to be having my first child, the response she received was, "That's a shame, we thought you might make partner." And that sort of thing has never happened to me. And that has been really helpful to me in securing the jobs I've been lucky enough to do, and in creating an environment where I felt able to perform straight away in the roles I was given. So I think there's white privilege, there's male privilege, there is the privilege of being the middle class son of a teacher, and I've benefited from an enormous amount of those things. Now, what's happened in telling myself the story of how lucky I am is that I feel lighter and happier. The sense of struggle has gone and being replaced by something much more contented and optimistic. And it has also, I guess, inspired in me a real determination to send down that ladder for more people, because it's not fair. And it doesn't, you know, we've got some big problems to take on as a species. And if we consistently get the answers to the problems that we're facing from just part of the population, the answers won't be as good, you know. And so it's important. It's important that quite quickly the whole is, you know, it's not only construction, it's not only Wates that needs to change. The way the world is wired up does need to change pretty quickly.
David, thank you for that total honesty and quite high vulnerability there. I really appreciate that. I would love more CEOs to talk like that, and to, number one, accept there is such a thing as white privilege, because unfortunately that still is being debated. I'm not sure the government are really helping particularly on that, rather than just accepting it. And as you say, change your own narrative, change your story, which is very powerfully said. You know, I've changed the stories I've told myself about my life, and it's actually made me more contented. So, you know, huge credit to you for that. And I just want to read, because I think it's really powerful. Rene Edo-Lodge just put it this: when I talk about white privilege, I don't mean that white people have it easy, that they've never struggled or that they've never lived in poverty. But white privilege is the fact that if you're white, your race will almost certainly positively impact your life's trajectory in some way, and you probably won't even notice it. And I think you pretty much sum that up extremely well. So thank you for that. And the reason I'm raising it as well for everyone listening is I think part of what I've taken on as part of my job is to keep bringing these really important topics up in organizations to go, it hasn't gone away, it hasn't been fixed. And if we don't keep talking about it, and as you then said, doing something about it, which again, I loved your second line, which was, well, you need to send down the ladder for more people to climb. Because if anyone's listened to me over the last year, you'll know that I'm a real believer in it's not a zero-sum game. This is not some win, some lose. This is everybody can win.
Yeah.
But it means the winners need to help others win. So sorry, you can say.
And we have a thing in our workforce is very the majority men. Our leadership is majority white, middle-aged men. But one of the great things about the construction industry is we have people who are managing directors of £300 million turnover businesses who began their lives as apprentice plumbers or as apprentice electricians or as brickies. And that kind of social mobility is fantastic. And one of the things that I think we need to overcome is the sense that people who have benefited from that kind of social mobility, who are white, feel threatened by our push to become more diverse. But in fact, we want that kind of social mobility to continue. The simple point is we want that mobility to be available and those opportunities to be available to everyone, regardless of any aspect of how they would define themselves.
So by the way, it's blowing up now on the Q&A and the chat. You'll be pleased to hear. So
in a good way.
Everyone's coming in, and a lot of positive message about appreciate the candor, seeming to care. I think Rachel, hey Rachel, good to see you, said a really important point. Employees are savvy. If it's all talk, they'll know. And knowing you, David, I know you'll take that as a compliment, not as a criticism. It's like, yeah, great, bring it on. Because otherwise, it as you say, leaders can sometimes say the performative right thing, but they're not transforming the organization. So. Jodie's just saying here, I think recent research showed that some do feel threatened by D&I, which is a really interesting point. And then Metro has said, do you think that the rhetoric currently, or actually lack of honest debate, is creating further division? Which is great, because the question I was going to ask you is, how are you bringing white, middle-class, middle-aged men with you? Because they are still in, as you said, majority positions, and there's a challenge there around they can be blockers if they don't come on the journey of exploring, privilege and race and kind of being willing to have this honest conversation. So how do you bring them with you?
I think the first thing is you have to accept that it won't happen overnight. You asked questions about time, and we have been talking about this now for a couple of years. So we are in this is go time. Is where we are as an organization. But I think it has been appropriate, particularly with everything that's been going on in the world, to allow to accept that change does take time, and that this is about people taking time to reflect on themselves, their lives, the lives of their families, and the people that they know less well, and that stuff is very difficult. Now I guess there is a natural impatience that I have around, well, look, I've done some of this thinking, I've shared some of the thinking and the reading and the listening and stuff that I've done, and I really do need you to come with me on this, because this matters to our business, it matters to me. But also, I think just being really clear that our target is to have 40% of our organization be female, not 50%. Actually, 50% of the people in the world who could make the best contribution to our business are women. So we've got men who are in a significant majority now, helping us work towards a target that would still see them be a majority in 2025. And over time, obviously, we have to move to a place where our targets get tougher and we really reflect the communities we work in. But we've provided a lot of tools and training for people. We've created opportunities for them to listen to colleagues and to experts, and we've encouraged them to read around the subject, and we've been really clear about what the targets are and what needs to change.
Well, I'm glad you brought up targets, because you're getting lots of questions about targets. So people are saying, we love that you've set them, love the level of ambition, but how do you ensure they're realistic and achievable? So do you think by 2025 you can move the dial as much as you have? And just secondly, have you tied them to leadership remuneration stroke bonuses?
I'll deal with the second one first. We are doing that from next year. So
Okay.
Our old remuneration scheme did not, our new scheme will.
Right.
So yes, including the way, I mean, and that starts with me, that process of including those things begins with me saying to my REMCO chair, the organisation should care about that. So I care about it. I want to be remunerated against my, according to my success in achieving this change.
Great.
The targets are ambitious, but they are doable. And we've made some really positive changes. Our graduate and trainee intake last year was 50-50 for the first time ever, male female. We weren't quite at the level of ethnic diversity that we wanted in that, but that was a start. Now, if we get closer to our other targets in our subsequent intakes, then that will also help. We're changing the way we recruit. We piloted quite a while ago now in our construction business, anonymized CVs, and some of those things I know have been in place in other organizations for a long time, but we were introducing them into our organization, and we're going through much more open recruitment processes than we've done before. It takes time. Back to the precious commodity of time, it does take managers and leaders more time to recruit in a better way, but getting the best people into your business is, if that isn't the job of leaders and managers, I don't know. I don't know what is. And I think then making sure that we retain these great people when we bring them in. We've recently appointed a brand and attraction manager to help us look in different talent pools for the people we bring in, not through the usual construction agencies. But the fundamental behaviour we need to change is how we plan the development of our workforce. So for our operations directors, our local MDs, to look ahead and say, well, I think I'm going to have 3 projects starting up over the next 9 months in this part of the world, and therefore I know I'm going to need 3 project managers. I'm going to kick off the recruitment now. 1 or 2 of these people may not come from the sector and may be delivering big system implementations for IBM or Accenture, or same skills of leading projects, but maybe from a different context, and that over time would make our organization better. That doesn't work if you wait till you've won the job and then you need a project manager to start on site on Monday, when what our industry has tended to do is then reach for someone who ran a job a bit like that for you 5 years ago, who will be exactly what you would expect that person to be.
Yeah, fantastic. And listening to you, it's really interesting, because I think there is something about, and then hear me right, everyone listening, it's the boring, dull processes and systems that need to be changed. And as dynamic, and you've been, fantastically dynamic today, David, in what you've said. I like the fact you're then rolling up your sleeves and going, and now I've got to go sit with Remco. And honestly, I've done some work with Remcos, and it's the most depressing. Spreadsheets and numbers, and if that and this and that does, it's not my bag. But it's the detail that go, actually, unless we change that, I can have all the great rhetoric. It requires the process and systems change. So again, great to hear that's
and it requires data, because there's no point in the legislation and the regulations require us to report on things like our gender pay gap, but they require it once a year at a group level, and that isn't the way that you make change, because people aren't attached to those targets. They're not attached to that data. They don't feel they can affect it. They don't feel they're going to be held to account for it. Whereas if you publish data on a project at a project level, if you publish that data on a regional level, by business unit level, then the people who are leading the way those businesses operate are tied to their data in terms of improving what the mix is. And that's, that is really hard work, and that is underway as well.
Yeah, brilliant. So we've got about 15 minutes left. Those who come regularly to an Impulse webinar will know we like to finish just before the hour, so we can give you time to go to the toilet or go and get another drink ready for your next webinar or whatever it might be doing. And in that time, we're going to be covering now, I'm going to be moving on a little bit to look at the business and actually some of the big targets around the climate crisis that we're facing. As we know, construction industry has been one of the biggest negatives on that side. We want to see how do we turn it into a positive. We're also going to talk about engagement, and then we're going to get your favorite leadership book, your favorite music, and your favorite movie, I think we said. So and just last one, we did have Jodie ask, and I might need a little bit more from you, Jodie, just on what you mean, but she said, are you doing anything to ensure that gender balance target is intersectional?
With ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation. So yes, we are measuring those things, and actually, it's when you measure those things and you look at the number of Black women that we have in leadership, it actually, that really brings to life the scale of the challenge and the scale of the opportunity to make our business better that we have ahead of us. So yes, we are doing that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jodie. So let's just move on. In 2020, before COVID struck, you set some ambitious goals for Wates to eliminate, and it's not really clear here, to eliminate waste and carbon from your operations by 2025.
Yeah.
And I just want to put this in context because I had a look. The government set the target for 2050, I believe. Balfour Beatty set their Kia has said they're going to do it by 2045. Balfour Beatty has said by 2040. And Morgan Sindall has said, and Wilmot Dixon, Anne Murphy, and BAM have said by 2030. So you are really setting a marker down in the
South. How people define their targets is really important in this. So what we have committed to is that our scope 1 and scope 2 waste and carbon will be at zero, and that we will be net nature positive in our work by 2025. The targets that you're referring to for those other people are other organizations. They are further out, but that's because they include scope 3, which then gets you to be looking at into your supply chain and looking at how carbon and waste move there. So it is about how we operate our business. We chose to limit it to scope 1 and 2 and to the things that we directly control so that we could make progress earlier, and that would build a momentum in our organization, because the reason those targets are, why people are picking 2045 for UK businesses is that you can't work in Scotland unless your target is 2045 for the public sector. So people are picking 2045 are going as late as they can, because that will require a different kind of partnership with the people who own the buildings that we maintain or who bring forward the schemes that they trust us to build for them. And the wider change that the built environment needs to make is so material to the way we as a species get through this. And it is really encouraging that we're starting to see the really forward-thinking organisations like the Crown Estate, like British Land, like Land Securities, are now really taking accountability for the long-term performance of the assets that they own. And they are starting to become interested in designing structures that can be dismantled, in kind of urban mining of the buildings that are there so that we get out the materials and the products that can be reused. They're looking more at refurbishment than creating new buildings, and that's good for us because that's one of the areas where we're particularly good. But there is a change now that is altering the nature of the requirements from our customers and the partnership that we will hopefully have with them. And we've started up, we set up last year a Wates Integrated Construction Services. It's all the bits of delivery that we do directly from our SES, very complex mechanical and electrical installations. So we're building a big £250 million battery plant for Nissan up in the northeast that uses a lot of SES's technology and our building expertise. It's the dry lining services, SES, and our offsite manufacturing facility. We've got a factory in Coventry that can make bathroom pods and service cupboards, and a lot of the electrical and mechanical installations that go into big buildings I think having a centre of excellence there that gets rid of the waste that you typically see on sites is so important to us and to our customers in the future. But I think it's a really exciting thing. You end up focusing on the quality of the design. If you focus on the quality of the design, the buildings will be nicer for people to use, whether they're working in them or playing in them, and living in them. I think there's some really exciting times ahead for the built environment. So.
And so, just last question on this: it's an ambitious target. COVID probably didn't help.
No. And that's down to some very little deep things, like in our cafeteria in our head office in Leatherhead. We've continued to wrap things and food in plastic to have people feel comfortable eating it rather than having it out on a counter. And that's we'd got rid of that sort of plastic. Everyone had a mug, and we had no disposable cutlery, and we'd done all of that stuff, and we had to take a step back and reset to have people feel comfortable working. And we have lost a little time, but that just means we've got to run a little bit faster now.
Fantastic, good. David, just with now about less than 10 minutes left, I want to look at engagement, and obviously really thrilled that Wates partners with Inpulse and our approach. And I guess straight off the bat, I wanted to understand, why is focusing on how people feel important to you? Because everyone listening, that's kind of one of our USPs. We do all the other questions that everyone would ask around engagement, but we also focus on actually asking the question, how do you feel about working at Wates? And people put actual emotions in there. So for you as CEO, what is that important? Why? What's it matter?
Well, I think fundamentally it's about the performance of the business and about us as an organisation displaying to people that we mean what we say when we say we're going to care about them. And that's one of the 3 behaviours that we set out to do, is to care for people and for their performance. So unless you really understand what people are feeling, you can't possibly get the best out of them. You can't properly engage them. You can't even really empower them in a way that makes sense to them, because I think people are guided by what they think, but the thing that really guides them is probably what they feel. The stuff is like this. I said earlier, the stories you tell yourself are more important than some of the stuff you would normally articulate, and it affects how they perform. It affects how they show up for the people around them. It affects the atmosphere in the teams that you're trying to get to collaborate, to work together, to do the best job that they can. And I think people, particularly in a male dominated environment, are pretty good at telling you what they think, but they are much less accustomed to, much less skilled at, and much less regularly tell you what they're feeling. And if you can get them to start sharing how they feel, I think that binds those people to you and to the organisation in a different and much more powerful way. And I think it's you said one of the first times I met you, you said, well, it's a risky thing the way your survey works, because people put in their information, they can see the scores arriving as soon as they press go on their submission. And so the first time you do that as a leader, you're thinking, please don't be too bad. And luckily it hasn't been so far. But that step is important, and you encouraged me that it was worthwhile by saying, well, your people are feeling those things whether you know about it or not, and you can either know about it and be able to respond, or they can bottle it up and you'll feel the consequences in a way that's unmanaged and that you're not in control of. And I think that has played out for us in terms of understanding, particularly during the very difficult moments last year. It was so encouraging that people gave the feedback they gave on how the organisation was treating them, despite some of the very, very difficult things that we had to do. So, I think it's about performance and honouring our commitment to care for the people, really care for the people who work for us.
Yeah, and I'm sure you won't mind me sharing with everyone listening that on your February 2021 survey, you're actually in the middle of one right now, so we can't quite give the results. And you do it much more regularly than you previously did, which is great. You're listening more regularly. But in the February 2021, your positive emotions that people chose was 72%, which is +4 on the Inpulse average across the whole platform and all the employees. But what was interesting was committed was 56% of employees had chosen the positive emotion of committed, which is 13 percentage points higher than for the Inpulse average. So there was really something about, I was looking at some of the comments earlier about people saying, you know, this kind of leadership, when felt and experienced, can have a positive, you know, reinforces a retention, it reinforces wanting to be part of this kind of organization. And there's no doubt we've seen that in your results with, you know, being 13% percentage points higher when it comes to the emotion of committed. What I will say, because I'm being very kind to you, is one thing that's still to work on in Wates is, but and to be fair, it's kind of an industry-wide, is well-being, which is still a little bit of an issue, because that is lower down than the Inpulse average. And I think still working out, and we're seeing this across the construction sector where we work, I think, with 6 or 7 of the largest construction firms, you know, well-being is still the sort of number one issue.
And I think the last 18 months have been very, very difficult from that perspective. We've seen, you know, I've seen a lot of my colleagues in leadership positions work harder than they should and feel more stressed than they should, and it's affected their well-being very significantly, you know, for a couple of them, and that is, you know, that's problematic, and we've got to change how we operate so that that stress is shared and dissipated and managed in a much more productive way.
Yeah, it's really interesting to say that. Something that's been emerging in some of my conversations, and I'll be sharing a bit more with you when we meet in a couple of weeks, is around almost acknowledging to the organization, and this can be a bit dangerous, but the analogy I'm using is like war. It's like the war's over. You can stand down and you use that language. And it's a bit, I totally accept it's a bit male and not necessarily the perfect example, but it's that sense of when you've been at 100% and you've given everything and the adrenaline's at its end, and, you know, all the things coursing through you, you know, all the chemicals, it's like you actually go, okay, it's stopped, or the fire has been put out. It's still smoldering. We're still a bit worried, but what's your thoughts on that?
Well, we're encouraging everyone, and it was the theme of the leadership conference last week. It will be the theme of our roadshow on the 22nd of October. But this idea of a personal reset, and it is that the focal point of what we do has been the pandemic. That focal point now needs to shift to be the goals that we set a couple of years ago, and that we need to now really accelerate our progress towards. But to do that, you can't just go from running at 100 miles an hour to then we've got to have this moment of reset. And if you think of what a reset does to a computer, you turn it off, the components cool down. If you reset properly, you know, all of the viruses or malware that's found its way into your programs, you get rid of that. You can then install the applications, you can install the data and the files that you need to perform, and when you turn the machine back on, everything runs a lot more efficiently and smoothly. And we're asking people to take time to reflect, to process a bit of what has gone on, to, you know, talk to their colleagues, talk to their families about how they feel, and then kind of recommit so that we really begin 2022 feeling that we are, you know, we are back on it. Our goals are back on. The world will never be quite the same again after COVID. There are some big negatives, but there are some big positives too. So reset is the language that we're using internally to describe exactly what you're saying. How do you take a moment? How do you process?
Yeah, and what I really like in that is the permission given, the permission granted. You know, please reset, please talk about it, please work out, as you say, what you need to just let go of and come down from. Look, with 2 minutes left, thank you everyone for staying. It's been a really high retention all the way through. As Lucy said up front, we had over 200 people join up. We always get asked to send out the video, which we'll be doing, don't worry, with some links as well to some of the targets the Wates have set. Bit as a fact finder, so you know I've not just made it up. But really quickly, with just a couple of minutes, I'd love to know, what's your favorite leadership book, David?
I love everything that Matthew Syed writes. So I think Rebel Idea is the idea that you make much better decisions if you have cognitive diversity in your teams and in your approach to problem solving. And his Black Box Thinking book before that compared kind of the airline industry and how it had learned from its accidents, and how the medical profession in which my wife works does not. And she found that very interesting as well. And there was a book from you mentioned I studied history at university. I was taught by a guy called Alistair Parker towards the end of his career for a couple of terms, and he published a book on Chamberlain and appeasement, and just the human thing of, it was based on all the cabinet minutes from 1935 to 39, and that you had this group of human beings trying to deal with this really unusual threat, and how they moved and thought as individuals and as the group through that. That's an interesting example in how leadership sometimes is very complex.
Fantastic. I'm just going to finish because I think Amna Khan, forgive me if I've said your name, I do apologise, has said, I joined this call with fairly low expectations, David. And I plan to have this running in the background.
Does she know me?
However, I haven't done a single email since you started speaking. As your commitment to leading people in an authentic and honest way, where you have an actionable plan for diversity and inclusion, is really refreshing. Great to see the link of metrics to remuneration as well. And someone else has put, thanks for your openness and honesty. So David, from me, I just want to say a huge thank you. Really, really appreciate the time you've given today. And yeah, I particularly appreciate the honesty and openness in all the things we've spoken about.
Pleasure. Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.